You see this sort of
That's a
treatment of
different question. What you're asking now is, are there some topics that should not be studied scientifically?
Right.
And is there some taboo? And Sam Harris speaks a lot about this.
Yes.
And I think the concern is, if you study some topic that's a hot button topic and you bring scientific methods and tools to it, we don't trust, I'm interpreting here, I think we as a society don't trust that people in charge in a free country won't try to legislate something that will constrict people's freedoms in the face of that information. I think that's...
Ben Shapiro sat down with Neil deGrasse Tyson, thinking he was going to score easy points by framing the left as anti-science, specifically around gender. But Neil deGrasse Tyson did not take the bait. Instead of getting into a science versus feelings argument, he redirected the entire conversation towards something Ben clearly was not prepared for: a discussion about freedom, power, and what happens when politicians get hold of scientific findings and use them to take rights away from people. This exchange gets more interesting the deeper it goes. Let's watch it in full, and I'll give you my thoughts on the other side.
Will slowly rise. You're going to flood your city because the storm that has the benefit of that extra inch, plus a storm surge, plus a higher intensity of the storm, because if the atmosphere is warmer, it carries more moisture. There's more heat driving the intensity of storms. You'll breach that, you'll flood the city. And there you have it. Or you lose your beach house. It happens in those storms. That's your first indication that your coastline is at risk. And not to mention those countries, island countries in the South Pacific, where the average elevation is a few feet above sea level. So you talked about refugees. You know who knows about global warming and who's preparing for it? Insurance companies and the military. The military cares, our military cares about where there is unrest in the world. Where, if people are displaced, that creates problems because they got to go somewhere. And the borders are closed, well, unless you're near a nice country, right? So yeah, it affects more than just your beach house.
No, for sure. I mean, the question becomes whether mitigation is the chief method of fighting this, or adaptation is the chief method of fighting this, or geoengineering. Should we be building more levies?
I
Should we be building
love
levees higher?
Geoengineering.
I mean, I'm a fan. I like technology. Technology is helpful.
It's in its infancy, geoengineering. But for me, one pie in the sky thought I have is, hurricane's coming and ready to destroy a city. You put in some big anemometer inside the hurricane, right? And it spins the anemometer. But the anemometer is itself a turbine, right? So it's sucking energy from the cyclonic motion of the hurricane, and you use that to drive the energy needs of the city that it might otherwise destroy.
You should propose that to President Trump. I mean, he's going to nuke a hurricane. This sounds better than that. So that's it. So moving on from climate change, which is an area, as I said, where some people on the right are not particularly interested, to areas where it seems like the left is militating against the advent of science. One of those areas is the area of transgenderism, where the argument made...
Curiously, there's I have no transgender letters.
It's true. It's true.
It was just
nothing
missing.
In the book. I know. So we've strayed now far from the topic of your book, but since I have you here and you're a science person who knows science, I'm going to ask you to science for me a little bit.
Sure.
But when it comes to transgenderism, the argument that is typically made by gender theorists is that gender is entirely separate from sex. You've seen the argument made that it makes no difference on average if men are stronger than women are, and that if we were to allow transgender women to compete with non-transgender women, then this would somehow not disadvantage biological women. And this seems to me absolutely ascientific, that if we're actually going to have a discussion about gender and sex, that should be based in data, which suggests that mammals are in fact binary in terms of their sex, unless you have intersex birth defects typically, or genetic defects.
I'm happy to opine on this. This only matters because today we segregate nearly all sports by gender. Otherwise, why do you even give a shit? What someone identifies with. So we live in a free country, and with consenting adults and people free expression of who and what they are.
I mean, on an adult level, I agree with you. I think it does matter what you teach your children.
That's what I'm saying. And so there's the matrix of what you are biologically, how you express yourself, who you choose as a sexual partner. If we actually live in a free country, as we tell ourselves, people's freedom to behave in any of those ways should not concern you at all. Nor are they requiring that you behave that way. Okay?
Well,
this is for their own freedoms, because we live in a free country. Now, what is unresolved here is, what do you do with sports? It's unresolved. And I've followed that closely, and I don't see any meaningful solutions to come down off of that. We know that hormones manifest differently in different people, and just the whole thing with steroids. Steroids are hormones, right? And we rallied against steroids in professional sports because it gives you an undue advantage. So I've tried to think of what the future of sports would be in the world of a gender spectrum. And it may be, you don't specify whether it's a male or female sport. You just take measurements of what your hormonal balances are. And so you compete based on your hormones. I mean, this is thought I had. I mean, I don't know. I don't know where it's going to land.
The WNBA won't be in business for very long if that's the case.
It would just be you'd have to find some way to compete people against each other if you still care that sports is an interesting activity.
I guess the area where it does come up in a non-sports area.
Yeah, tell me, I don't know.
So it would be, you talk in your book about the education of children and teaching children about science. And right now, children are being taught about the quote-unquote gender spectrum, which is not scientifically based. That is a theory-based idea.
No, wait, hold on. People express themselves on a spectrum. So you learn that.
That's a social point, not a scientific point. Meaning we express ourselves
hold on.
based in different languages. Is that something you teach in science class, or is that something that you teach when you're teaching language?
So whether the fact that people want to express themselves on a spectrum, on a gender spectrum, whether that fact is something you want to put in a sociology class or in a science class, maybe that remains to be determined. But it is a real fact about real society.
Well, of course, nobody's denying that people identify how they want to identify.
So
the question is, what is the relationship of that to biology? Meaning that the argument is made that trans women are women, for example. And what that seems to mean is that trans women are identical to women. Now, if people want to say trans women are not biological women, obviously that is the case. But people don't seem to want to say that, although that is obviously scientifically true. Trans women are not biological women. Biological women are biological women.
But where are you going with this? What are you trying to accomplish by asking yourself, is it science or is it not science? It's people in society.
But this is a perfect example of an area where suddenly it doesn't matter to say things that are just true. Like, why is it bad or wrong to point out?
I have another way to approach this. I care what is objectively true in the world as a scientist. But let me not say even as a scientist. I just simply care what is objectively true. And science happens to be a pretty potent path to invoke, to find out what is true. And so if people express themselves on a gender spectrum, and that is an actual thing in an actual society, if we have not fully explained that scientifically, that's an interesting frontier to study. If you want to say it's only sociological, then it's the purview of the social sciences. I don't care who studies it. It's an interesting fact about society that's worth learning about. To fight someone and say, it's not biological, it's just your this, it's real and it's there.
Well,
because it's real because it manifests.
But it is real because it manifests. But the question of how to classify manifestation is a scientific question, meaning that For example, there was a woman over at Brown University. She came out with a study that suggested that there was a phenomenon called rapid onset gender dysphoria, in which a member of a particular group would suffer from gender dysphoria, and this person's immediate peer group would suddenly have an onset of gender dysphoria. This paper was so controversial that Brown tried to pull it, and then was forced to reassign it later. You see this sort of
That's a
treatment of
different question. What you're asking now is, are there some topics that should not be studied scientifically?
Right.
And is there some taboo? And Sam Harris speaks a lot about this.
Yes.
And I think the concern is, if you study some topic.
Let's start with the move Ben Shapiro made, right at the top, because it's the move he makes in almost every debate, and it's important to recognize it. He opened by framing the left as militating against science, not disagreeing with a specific finding, not questioning a specific study against science itself. That framing is designed to set up a conclusion before the conversation even begins. You make yourself the defender of reason and your opponent the enemy of truth, and now you never actually have to win the argument on substance. Neil deGrasse Tyson saw it coming immediately and refused to play on that ground. What Neil did instead was go straight to the question of freedom. And this is where the conversation shifted into something genuinely important. He said it plainly: people's freedom to live and express themselves as who they are does not require anything from you. Nobody is knocking on your door demanding you change. Nobody is asking you to adopt a new identity. So the question worth asking is, why does someone else's freedom bother you so much that it requires legislation to stop it? That is not a science question. That is a power question. And then Neil made the point that I think is the most underrated moment in this entire exchange. When Ben kept pushing on whether gender expression is science or sociology, Neil said something that cut through all of it. He said he simply cares about what is objectively true, not as a scientist, just as a person. And then he said, if something is real and manifesting in actual society, whether it has been fully explained scientifically or is better studied through the social sciences, it is still real. It still deserves to be understood. You do not get to dismiss something as not science to make it disappear. But the moment that reframes the entire debate is when Neil talks about what he calls the fear. He said, as a society, we do not trust that people in power in a free country will not try to legislate something that constricts people's freedoms based on scientific findings. And that is not paranoia, that is history. The eugenics movement of the early 20th century used real science about heredity, twisted it, and produced real legislation that stripped real people of real rights. It was not superstition defeating science. It was science being picked up by the wrong hands and turned into a weapon against vulnerable people. Neil is not being theoretical when he warns about that pattern. He is reading directly from the documented record. And then he made it concrete with the gay rights example. He said he was asked whether being gay is biological or psychological, and his answer was he does not care which it is. Find out what it is. That is fine. But the answer to that question should have no bearing on legislation or law. And then he explained exactly why. If the finding is biological, people say, oh, that explains it. If the finding is psychological, suddenly someone with power decides that means you can be sent to conversion camps to be realigned. The science becomes the permission slip for the cruelty. That is the danger. Not the research itself, but what politicians do with it once they have it. Ben kept insisting that you should bring out all the science and let the politicians hash it out. And Neil's response was the correct one. The history of that exercise, when it involves findings that touch on people's constitutional freedoms, does not end well. That is not an argument against science. It is an argument for protecting people's freedoms, regardless of what science discovers. Those are not in conflict. You can pursue truth and still refuse to let truth become a tool for oppression. The most revealing moment of the whole conversation was when Neil asked Ben directly, where are you going with this? What are you trying to accomplish? Because that question exposes the entire game. When someone hammers the same question over and over, is it science or not? Is it real or not? And never explains what they would do with the answer, they are not chasing truth. They are hunting for a label they can use later to justify a policy they already decided they want. Neil deGrasse Tyson walked into a debate about science and quietly turned it into a warning about freedom. And he did it by being more genuinely curious, more willing to follow the facts wherever they lead, and more honest about the dangers of power than the person who came in claiming to be the defender of reason. That is the adult in the room, and it is not close. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit the thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on the bell notification. I'll see you in the next one.